to the forecast, which the forecast or what we're up for is for review and discussion today.
Okay, so here is the results from the most recent vintage, which is 23 population estimate for Clatsop County. And here you can see there is a difference between the green bars, which is from the most recent one, and the dotted line or dashed line. This is because, as I just mentioned, we received more information, so we went back to 21, 22, and also 20, and we revised the population estimates for the county for those years. So as you can see from the most recent pension, there was actually, it's not drop, but it's like very small drop, even they are like equal in 20 and 20, between 20 and 21, which was the pandemic time. And this is was because we can see that reflected here in the component of change, which are the natural change and also the net migration. So they are equally. That's why we see there was no like drop as happened in some other counties. And then because of net migration, the number of the population estimates for the county increased again in 22 and 23. So the main reason of the increasing in the number of population for Clatsop County is because of the net migration. This is the case for most of counties in Oregon. It's not because the natural change, but it's because of in-migration. All since the most recent census, which is 23-22, there is an increase in the population of the county from 41K to 42K as of July 1st, 2023. And we hand it over to
Thank you. Yeah. So zooming out, right? This is zooming is a really focused picture of what has happened over the course of the past 3 years, you know, from 2020 to 2023, over time, right? So if we zoom out, we can see the change in the county over a longer period of time. So this graph is going back to 1970 and showing population growth in Clatsop County. And the big thing that I want to draw attention here to is the difference between 2010 and 2020, where we saw an increase of the population upwards of about 10.9%, which is pretty large growth for a county and pretty high for Clatsop, definitely outpacing the growth that we had expected the last time that we made these forecasts. And so you can see an upward adjustment just in the estimates themselves based off the information that we got in the 2020 census, informing, you know, like this change in population. So these growth, you know, it's leading to a forecast that is growing, but that's stabilizing over time. And so what happened and what's contributing to this, you know, Huda and I keep mentioning natural change versus net migrants, and that's really how we, you know, focus this, you know. So it's really because we saw more people coming into the county than leaving. It's really just that, like, this has become a more attractive destination in terms of places that people are going to. And that's reflected in that high migration that we've estimated between 2015 and 2019, right before that dawned. Right? A lot more people that have been coming here historically have started coming in. It's not because necessarily people are having a lot of kids within this area that's leading to like booming growth. In fact, it's one of the few places, you know, not one of the few places, there's a handful of counties, but from the 2015 to 2019 period, there was also more deaths than births within the county itself, you know. Already hitting this trend that the U.S. at a national level is expected to hit by 2038. It's indicative of an older age population, not necessarily lower fertility rates, which is a thing in Clatsop, but we expect this to be exacerbated in the near future moving forward. You can see part of that in the 2020 period. Part of this is COVID driven, definitely, as there was an uptick in the number of deaths that happened in this period, but a lot of it also is population aging that we think is going to move forward. So we do think that Clatsop is going to cool off a little bit in terms of its migration, that it's not going to keep this high of about 600 people like annually, or 650, but closer to around 450 migrants into the county, net migrants total, right? And for cities, of course, this is going to differ. This doesn't take into account inter-county migration, people who move within one county, within Clatsop County from one city to another. So that's a separate dynamic that's happening here, but overall growth across the county that's happening. Because of more net migrants, and the slowing down is coming from the natural change. So number of births have been on the decline pretty much since 2005. You can see the number of births in the area has fallen off, was kind of stable, saw a jump in 2005, but then fell back down in the area all the way down to 2020, beyond 2020, beyond that, as the forecasts. The numbers there reflect the average number of births in a given year during that 5-year period. So you can see in 1990 and 1994, there was about 420 births on average within the county. But by 2014, 2015, that fell down to 393, and we expect that to continue to fall again. It is a combination of population aging, but also the number of kids people having falling as well. Deaths, on the other hand, increased over time. It really jumped up during the pandemic period, but it's not just because of COVID. Again, this has to do with population aging. By 2020, everyone, most of the population born into the boomer generation is now age 65 plus. This is a very large birth cohort, right, of individuals. And as they get into the older ages, 75, 85, 95 plus, we expect there to be a large number of deaths reflected as they continue to age moving forward, accounting for some of this increase in death that you're seeing as well. This isn't to say that people aren't living healthy lives like within Clatsop. We have seen big increases in life expectancy, the reverse of mortality rate within the county. People are living longer, healthier lives than they have. Definitely compared to the 90s and early 2000s, that slowed a bit in the late 2000s, but we expect that to pick up later. And again, people to continue to push that frontier of life expectancy and live longer lives as they move forward. On the flip side, looking at the fertility rate on that right graph over there, fertility rates in the county have historically been higher than the state of Oregon. People in the county tended to have more births. We expect that to continue to happen, but you see this big drop off in the 2020 period as well that coincided with COVID and to date hasn't bounced back. It's 2023, our estimates are coming in, and the fertility rates that we're seeing are still on par with post-COVID times and not the pre-COVID, certainly not the 2010, 2015 fertility rates that we saw, which were almost at 2 kids per woman. It's much closer to about 1.5 kids per woman now at this point within the county, and something that we continue to expect to see decline. We definitely have counties that are about 1.2. And while we don't think that that's going to happen within Clatsop County in the next 20, 30 years, getting closer to that rate and heading towards that seems to be the general direction. We haven't seen certainly countries where we've had a bounce back in fertility rate. We haven't seen very many counties where we've seen a bounce back. This tends to be the general trend of what's going on. And what's reflected in the US national forecast as well. And so as these life expectancies increase and populations have less kids, aging is going to become more of an important factor. In 1990, you can see that we had in these population pyramids ordered from old ages on the top to young ages on the bottom. More of the population was a younger age. But even by 2020, we've seen this shift, and the retirement age population in Clatsop County is a bit higher than the rest of Oregon, as indicated by this high amount of population in the graph. So both of these come from census data. These are both estimates. We're not doing anything here. Our forecasts are what's shown over here, and this is the expectation of the shift should the birth and death rates continue in the way that we think. This skewed pattern in terms of now the population is going to be aging moving forward and be top heavy in terms of a mostly older age population moving forward. In terms of race ethnicity within the county, we've seen some consistent growth in the Hispanic population, but fluctuations in the white population on the year-to-year average and what's going on. Oh, sorry, I saw a question come up. Is the aging population for the county or the state? That is for the county. Sorry, I should have made that clear. This is This one's for the county. I put that Clatsop County on there, but yeah, it's for the county. I should have stated that. And this is, so part of drawing into this, so the white population has fluctuated while the Hispanic population has grown. This is part of our new mandate where we're required to make forecasts by race and ethnicity as well. Part of this has to do with the skew and the age distribution between these. The white population being a bit older than the Hispanic population in the area, leading to the eventual population decline, which we've seen a little bit between 2010 and 2010, but we have observed in other counties as well. So at this point, I'm going to go through the UGB city level forecast. And they're going to follow kind of the same pattern, much briefer, succinct information that I'm giving here. But again, I'm going to be highlighting what we've seen in the past, how that's informing what we've seen in the future, and how that's different, than what we were estimating, forecasting rather, 4 years ago. So please feel free to stop me at any time if there's any part that we want to discuss. So the first thing that I want to do is that what we're forecasting here is the population within the urban growth boundary, right? And that's different than the population within the city. This is the expandable area that could be incorporated to within the city. Because the goal of these forecasts is there enough built land within the UGB for the city to conceivably grow in the trajectory that we think that we're making these forecasts, right? And if not, then we need to go back and use this as a justification potentially for expanding the UGB moving forward. So implicit in these forecasts, and maybe I should have said this earlier, is we are not taking into account the current boundary being a restriction on population growth, because these are supposed to be used as a guide of given that this is the demand and the expectations in terms of bursts moving forward, do we think that there's a reason to expand the UGB? So looking at Astoria, this is a city snapshot, so a city population of about 10,181 individuals as of the 2020 census. That's an increase of about 7.4% from the last census, and an increase in 5% of the housing units. The persons per household is lower than the state average of about 2.65 at about 2.1, but an occupancy rate that is pretty high for the county, and you'll see some differences in other areas as well, hovering about 90%. I think that's lower than the state, but definitely higher than the rest of the county. High employment rate of about 96%, and household income of about 70,000. Non-white population of about 15%, lower than the state averages, but an age 65 plus also that is a little bit older. And just as a baseline here, the Oregon age 65 plus is about 18.7%. The US is about 18.2 or 3%. So Oregon's a little bit older than the US. Clatsop is a little bit older than the rest of Oregon as well, and informing some of that slowing in the population growth that we're expecting to see. So looking back at the 30-year period for Astoria, we've seen some fluctuations between 1999 and 2000, slow growth, 2000 and 2010, population decline, some bounce back in the population again in 2020. Housing units have been a little bit more stable in their growth rate. And then you'll also notice differences here. The population estimate is for the city. This is taken directly from the most recent census. Here's our estimate for the UGB. So the estimate here is 10.3 for the UGB area, whereas it's 10.2 for the city. Some places that's going to be exactly the same, other places it'll differ more. Just want to make sure you know that those numbers are different intentionally and where they're coming from. So for the forecast period, last time we did these forecasts, because we saw that fluctuation in growth, it was pretty much a flat baseline in the forecast. So Astoria is one where we had to pump it, and we expect more near-term population growth, even though at the end of the 50-year time period, we expect this to end up in population decline and end up at the same level. A bit of this is aging, and I'm going to say that in the 20-year period where we are getting a better idea of what the more recent migration dynamics and birthing dynamics are happening, this is something really important to look like, and that's why you see the increase, because we saw more people both coming into the county as well as the city in this area, giving us a higher expectation that we had seen before. Nevertheless, the more long-term that we look at this, we're gonna see those lower fertility rates and aging population have an impact of both either population decline or slowing population growth over time. So that's what you're observing here. And another graph that I want to show that we're going to be showing for each UGB is how does that growth compare to the county as a whole, the region, and as well as the US expectation from the US Census Bureau growth that we have seen. So in this light green line, I have the city of Astoria, how it's historically grown, how we're expecting it to grow into the future, and then the light blue, how the county's growth has looked. The county has been a bit below the rest of the region in terms of population growth moving forward. And how does that compare to the region and the US? You know, so we have a baseline of like, what does this growth look like? Is it anomaly? Is it high? Is it low with respect to its population growth over time? Cannon Beach. Again, some differences between the city and the UGB boundary here. This is also a moment for review for us. So DLC, we pulled this from the 2023 DLCD GIS database of the most recent UGB boundaries and definitions for locations. And we have had this be an instance before where cities have told us that is maybe an outdated boundary and we have to go and inform DLCD. So please also look at this and make sure this aligns with your understanding of the UGB boundary as well, because that's something that we can go back and report to DLCD. That was the time that it ended up, there just ended up being a lag. They hadn't finished the UGB boundary in time for us to incorporate it into the forecast. It wasn't approved until the next year, but just something to keep in mind as well. So population in Cannon Beach over a 10-year period from the 2010 census fell by about 10%, hovering about 1,500 people. At the same time, housing units increased up to about by 5% to about 1,900. Occupancy rate is 37.34%. In the area, I mean, oh, sorry, I saw a question.
We have questions on how the occupancy rates calculated.
Yep. So it's it is full, it is living there a majority of the time. In the sense of the census and the way that this one is calculated is this your primary residence as of April 15th, 2020? I think that's the correct date. But it's a particular date and time. Is this the primary residence where you spend a majority of your time in the given year?
Over half of the year, so that's why seasonally vacant housing is a contributor to lower occupancy rates here.
Yeah. So seasonality in housing is going to, is going to contribute into this low calculation of the occupancy rate that we're seeing. As well as so high employment rate here, much above the state in terms of the population that is there at the time. I should mention this. This comes from a survey. This comes from the American Community Survey, which is an average over the 5-year period between 2018 and 2022. So each year within there, they survey individuals. For all individuals surveyed within Cannon Beach, it's the are you seeking employment? Are you in the employment sector? And are you currently employed is how they calculate that. And so that's not a full census of all individuals, but rather that comes from a survey of amongst the people that we've interviewed in Cannon Beach, how many of them were employed. It looks like almost everyone, who was seeking employment was actually employed. Household income about 63,000, non-white population 16.12, and the age 65 plus that is a bit older than the rest of the county as well as Oregon. Population dynamics fluctuated a bit, prior to this decline that we saw a big increase in the population in Cannon Beach, although housing units have increased, and I think we can talk about like the different ways in which, housing is being utilized within the area. I mean, I think we're all thinking about the same things of how is this housing unit increases while the population isn't increasing, whether that be part-time stays, whether that be like, part-time rentals or things like in that matter. But the relationship between population and housing highlighted here. And because of this like fluctuation in growth rate, again, it's hard for us, we saw a decline in the 10-year period. We think that'll come back, but a relatively like stable population over time. We did see this big jump between 1990 in 2000. We aren't anticipating another big jump in that regard again as well. But it's been stable-ish, you know, over time on average between 2000 and 2020. And this is what our forecast is anticipating as well, in terms of population change. You'll see it was a little bit less than last time where we were anchored on that 2010 estimate. Since then, it has come down, in terms of population. And so we're a little bit lower than last time, but nonetheless stable population in this case. And again, how does that growth compare? You can see to the county, to the region, and to the US as well. Gerhardt City and UGB in this case. And I know that part of this area in the UGB, I don't think is available for housing development in there. So an important thing for us to think about when it takes into account for development, housing development. So a big increase here in the population, up 22% from the last census. Housing not necessarily keeping up in pace, but you know the housing to population ratio is a bit bigger here, albeit although you know the occupancy rate that you're seeing there again calculated affected by that seasonal housing is at 50%. High employment rate, very high household income, but a population here that is even older than some of the other locations that we've seen. Increase in population and housing. Here, you know, this is an interesting case where even in post-COVID, you know, and this is true of Clatsop maybe more so than other locations where some destinations became particularly attractive in the COVID era. This is one where we continue to see population growth. And so in that 10-year period, we're expecting a lot of growth between now and then. Between now and 2030, and for that to continue, the growth to continue to happen, but to be more tapered, slower over time. And that's a pretty drastic change again here from the last time we made these forecasts where we were quite a bit lower. Gerhardt, a lot of people ended up, you know, moving there, I think in the latter half of the 2015-2020 period of the, you know, and that's continuing to happen. And so a big jump up from the last time we made these forecasts.
So this is Peter Watts. I'm the city attorney for the city of Gerhardt. And a couple of things I just want to put out there, and I don't want to speak for the rest of Clatsop County. Your population estimate for us was dramatically off. So between 10 and 20, you had estimated that we would be at 6%. We're at 22 plus. We have an acute housing shortage on the Oregon coast, the northern Oregon coast. In fact, the lack of housing is a barrier to our population growth. So like Warrenton hired a city manager who was not able to take the job because they couldn't find a house. We have the commander of the Coast Guards had trouble finding a house for his family. The Coast Guard people are having trouble finding housing. We are seeing housing built as quickly as it can be built in our city. And again, I can't speak for the rest of the county, but anecdotally, I'm hearing the same thing. We, the cities in the county, in some respects, have to work collaboratively because a place like Gerhardt has a limited amount of land that we can build. And I think you pointed out some of our issues with our UGB and the state having a no build line so that you can't build the rest of the line. So these are all things we're struggling with now. I'm very concerned with, as you point out, we do have an aging population. We have seen in-migration from the Portland metropolitan area. That population needs first responders, medical care, all of these things. The hospital is not able to find workforce housing for nurses. They're using traveling nurses. And it just seems like you are projecting a very low population compared to what, certainly in Gerhardt, we've experienced over the last 6 or 7 years. And we were not seeing a lot of housing until, 16, 17. Then we were seeing, and we're seeing a dramatic, just no slowdown on the housing. The thing that's slowing it down, if anything, is lack of contractors. So I just bring that up because we feel like we were very much shorted on our state shared funds. We got less than we should have got. And also because these cities need workforce housing. And when like your numbers were so far off when we did our buildable lands inventory and housing needs analysis, that we can't use it. And we're going to have to do that again, which is hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that also perhaps prevented some expansions that would address some of these issues right now, which I consider to be acute. And, we in Gerhardt have very strict short-term rental regulations. We're using every tool we can think of in order to support the housing that we need. But that housing's probably going to need to happen in other cities because we just don't have very much land. And so when I see something like, when we have the Coast Guard commander not able to find housing for himself, well, if he eventually did, or the guys, and then that's a 6% increase. I mean, maybe it will only be 6%, but because that is artificially lowered through the lack of housing. And I work around the state, and it's just nowhere. I am aware of nowhere else where we have this big of an issue as the Northern Oregon coast. And I think Tillamook County is affected as well. So I want to put it out there. So thank you for having a number that's more in line with what we're seeing in Gerhardt. I appreciate it, but I'm very concerned at the other numbers that I'm seeing.
Yeah, I appreciate that hearing that. I think, we have all joined, I think, since that time. And so, we have the benefit now of looking back and having good data. I caught my ear when you were mentioning that most of the development has happened since 2016. And so, what I'm wondering was how much of that data on population change and growth the last forecasters have, they produced that forecast, if they had not captured that, uptick in growth. So, I mean, definitely the land use plan system is not intended to constrain housing production or population growth at all. It's only intended to make sure that there's an adequate supply appropriate so that it can be planned for and set aside. And so, what I'm also hearing though is that the constraints on growth in Gerhardt are not related to, permitting processes, they're related to just the supply of buildable land, that being insufficient. And that really does set off alarm bells for me and think, that we probably need to have a meeting, and talk about the most recent housing needs analysis or the most recent buildable land inventory, because, in situations where growth is artificially constrained by the lack of buildable land, that produces lower population growth, which then, informs an expectation of lower population growth. So I think that, this may be a case where, a pending change in UGB could have a big effect. We're projecting the population growth within the current UGB boundary that expanded. I think it's a question on, would this forecast be appropriate for that expanded larger UGB? But if the land in UGB is already built out and possibility of infill development is not great, then this may be accurate for that current boundary and for that current boundary.
I think you also had mentioned as well, and I just want to be clear on the distinction in the way that the estimates and the forecast are used, that like it's the estimate undercount that affected the share of state funding in terms of how much money you're getting. And I know that, and for the forecast as well, Clatsop was an outlier in regards to like how much we were maybe off the mark there. And I think that like that's all that also happened with the US Census Bureau in terms of their estimates for for the county as well. It's something that I think that like is totally fair to be critical of us in terms of like where we missed the mark in that regard. And I think that's like, we want to be here to have that conversation as well and to discuss like, how did we miss that process happening between 2016 and 2020 when the population like really took off? And we weren't able to get those numbers incorporated at a time that it needed to happen for the housing needs analysis. And how can we prevent that from happening moving forward, I think is, why we're having the discussion right now.
On that last one, I think there are two things that we have started to do for cities to make sure that we are tracking things more accurately. Of course, tracking the city population is very difficult because the tools we've used in the past are mainly housing changes. And if a population is growing, but that's because, occupancy is going up and households getting larger, people moving in together, or living in informal or unpermitted housing, we're going to miss that using the traditional methods. So in the past 2 years, we've started to collect additional data on births and deaths that are happening at the city level. Previously, we did that only at the county level. And we've also started to collect information as best we can on migration to and from a city. It's very hard to figure out what migration flows are like between cities. It's very hard to do that even for counties. Some counties previously are the only level we try to do that at. But we now have indications on moves at the city level that come with a little bit of lag, but enough that we're going to begin consulting those. So we have some indication, ways that populations can be changing that are not related to the changes in the housing stock.
I want your input on this as well. I think a challenge for us in figuring out populations for a place like Gearhart, where there's an interesting dynamic in terms of the relationship for the housing stock and potential like housing growth, how there might be a change in the way that some of these housing units are used. It's hard for us to gauge when a population might decide like, no, this is the full-time residence where I have. And it opens up migration more because like where it was a temporary residence, now it's a permanent residence. And I think that's a little bit harder for us to track. For a place where the occupancy seemingly from this metric is like pretty low, but might shift in a different way. And now we have to allocate and think about population growth separately. So this all to say is that I'm trying to pry at like how the housing stock is currently being used. Have you seen shifts in the way in terms of like movements from temporary stays to more permanent stays? Is there a constraint on the number of people who can't find housing because of the way that housing is currently being utilized within Gearhart?
So I know people didn't tune in to hear me talk, but
I did. It's okay.
What we did is we strictly regulated short-term rentals. We grandfathered people in, but then we said that when they sold the house, it could not be used as a short-term rental. So our goal was to return particularly what was traditionally workforce housing back either to a long-term rental or a house. We've noticed one of the things we look at is the number of calls that our fire department responds to, some of which are fires, but most of which are other things. And I was staffing the city council last night, and in January and February of 23, there were 82 calls. And in January and February of 24, there were 112. So yeah, it's because they're a lot more, but between 10 and 20, 2010 and 2020, our occupancy went from 45% to 50. We think it's continuing to increase. The housing production's continuing to increase. But we're having a lot of trouble hiring the first responders because of the lack of housing. So yeah, and again, like we're doing what we can as far as the short-term rentals, but we have a project now that can be built under county zoning. It'd be like 19 houses under. If it were inside the city's UGB, it's more like 50. And we currently don't have a means to necessarily expand our UGB. And it would be such a waste in our mind if people are on 1 acre lots versus in an R1 residential. But again, we're really hamstrung by our last buildable lands inventory and housing needs analysis. And Gerhardt's not the city that can take the population because of topography, and because of the soils and slope and things like that, where the cities that could take the population are our neighbors. And you know, so that's what we're struggling with here.
Yeah. No, totally. Yeah. I think I want to keep this conversation going. I want to say, can we reach out afterwards? Just so we can keep moving forward with time.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I appreciate, yeah.
Okay, may I add something, please, regarding the population estimates, because you mentioned that some cities or your city sometimes feel like this population estimate is low or something like that. So we would appreciate it if anyone from any city reach out to us right after we publish the preliminary estimates. This is come by mid of November, and we receive some comments from those cities who feel like, oh, we feel like this number is lower than we expect. And then we have a conversation with the city during this month of review from November until December, until we reach out to, we understand, we try to explain to them, how did we come up with this number? And we show them the statistics or data that we use. And then they discuss with us until we come up with an estimate that we both agree this is the most accurate estimate for the city. So I do appreciate it. If you please keep an eye on our website, and also, as I mentioned, we send a letter to all city officials by mid of November. So please keep an eye and wait for this. By next November 24, we will be ready with the preliminary estimate for all cities, and we will also post them to our website. Please reach out to us if you feel this is not the most accurate population estimate for your city, and we appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I will say that Oregon is a little bit different than other states in that we have this back and forth process. And in the forecast in particular, where we separate it out into 4 different regions so we can have communication like this. And we're never shy away from these conversations. And I just want to make sure that we will reach out to continue that conversation moving forward so that we can get these to be like the best forecasts that we can get and the best estimates that we can get. Just moving forward for the sake of time, Seaside, just south, Gerhardt, in this case, distinction between the city and the UGB, population growth of about 10% here as well. Housing unit increase a bit slower at 3.8, a little bit higher occupancy rate in persons per household, about 2.2. Again, age 65 plus, that is a bit over even the quarter of the population here. So more stable housing or population increases here in Seaside, slower housing growth. And again, we expect that to move forward a bit higher in this forecast cycle than, growth outpaced expectations again here and like this location. And we thought it was going to continue to grow, and you can see it just that all sort of shifted up for Seaside as well. Comparison here for Seaside, not relative to the county and the region. So but it's generally been above the county. And in this near forecast period, we expect it even to be higher than the region average as well, including like the counties of Washington, Clackamas, and Yamhill and things in that regard. Before it stables around here, still above the county, but much closer to the rest of the region and growth rate. Warrenton over here, city and UGB are pretty much in terms of developable land, the same thing here. I think there's a very small difference here. 25% increase in the population, age 65 plus to this high, but not as high as some of these other cities that we had talked about. Household income about 70,000, high employment rate. consistent population growth, and also more consistent housing growth, over time as well. This is a location where we have a higher expectation in the near-term population growth, but again, a lower expectation in the long-term population growth, having to do with the aging population and lower birth rate, affecting this, warranted in this location. We saw a big increase of 25% between 2010 and 2020. And again, outpacing expectations of growth for the area, and we think that's going to carry over a bit into 2030 before slowing down. Again,
Warrenton will be driven by the higher percentage population that's aging.
Yeah, that's definitely a thing that's slowing down the long-term population growth. And again, the plot here showing the growth relative to the region of county Warrenton. It was historically been an outlier in population growth.